So I'm the city's director of disaster recovery and compliance. My office is administering these particular grant funds. My plan tonight is to run through how to access the application, and then go through the different requirements in the application and how to fill it out. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's 6 o'clock on the dot, so I would rather folks can kind of catch up if they come in a little late. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So for those of you that everyone can hear me, right? Okay. For those of you that have not been on the city's website or aren't overly familiar with it, when you get there, you would go to departments, you would select disaster recovery, and then you would scroll down to Neighborhood Economic Recovery Fund. And this will give you sort of information about this particular pot of money that's been set aside. So it's 12 million out of ARPA funding. And the idea here is to basically help neighborhood business districts and critical neighborhood facilities recover from the pandemic. So tonight, we're going to talk about the general application for funding. To access that, you would sort of click on this link. There's a second application that is geared specifically towards neighborhood councils and specific capital improvements to improve walkability within those neighborhood business districts. I will be doing a separate technical assistance session for that application next Wednesday night. So if you're interested in that, if you're a member of a neighborhood council and you may also want to put in an application under that, I would encourage you to join next Wednesday. On this particular website, we talk about both applications, some of the eligible project categories. There is a map here, or there's two maps, and I'll go over the one that pertains to the general application in just a minute. There's also information about technical assistance that's available. As you can see, I just recorded this session. Once it's recorded and we've finished, I'll post it here probably tomorrow, and there'll be a link just like to the one that I did 2 weeks ago. There's also my contact information down here. This is the same website where we will post updates about funding. So when funding announcements start to be made, they'll get posted here. And any other information or changes to the application or anything like that will all be posted here. So sort of jumping into the application, I want to just bring up this map first. So basically, out of the general fund, the areas shaded in green are the areas that are eligible. So entities putting applications in for this pot of funding under the general application would need to be located in or serve these areas. These are called qualified census tracts, and they are determined by the federal government and were determined by the U.S. Treasury in this instance as related to this grant funding. So if you are not located or the entity that you're planning on submitting an application on behalf of is not located in or does not serve one of these shaded areas, you would likely not be eligible for funding. So I just want to make that clear to everyone. I just accidentally X'd out of the application. So now going into the application itself, as you will see, there are several tabs. This looks a lot more overwhelming than it actually is, which is why I'm going to walk you through it and help you see that it's not that overwhelming. So the first part is really just the introduction, and that's just some background information on why the funding was allocated and where it was allocated from. Section 2, this is the section labeled what projects are eligible and how to apply for funding. So specifically here, we kind of get into the meat of the sorts of projects we're looking for under public and commercial space activations. This is, so I think projects that we would be looking for in this category would be those that increase foot traffic, they improve pedestrian safety. It could include things like storefront or facade improvements. It could include things like retail and vendor markets, public art, cultural activities, public music activities. Some ideas that we've heard were things like public yoga in some of the business commercial districts to try to bring folks downtown. Those would all be things that would potentially be eligible. Other things that might be that folks that would be considered eligible would be storefront lighting upgrades, improvements for access to public transit, or upgrades for pedestrian safety. So, you know, some of the other ideas that we've heard that we think would potentially be eligible would be, I don't know if folks have seen sort of the Valley bike stations in and around downtown. Installation of something like that in neighborhood commercial districts would potentially be eligible. Any activities that might improve the commercial character of the neighborhood, vacant or commercial space activation. So some of the other ideas that folks have been proposing to us are pop-ups in vacant commercial spaces, anything that would sort of activate those commercial spaces in a way that obviously they weren't activated during the pandemic, and that would sort of help those business districts recover from the decreased foot traffic as a result of the pandemic. The second category are digital equity projects. So things that we would consider eligible would be digital skills trainings, projects that might improve the accessibility to the public for various social services for the most impacted populations. So we've heard some neighborhoods that want to do assessments of digital accessibility or creation of digital marketplaces. Those sorts of things would be eligible. So, you know, by a digital marketplace, what we mean is maybe a bunch of businesses or nonprofits want to sort of band together to better attract folks towards their services or their goods. All things that could be considered eligible under that category. The third category is upgrading to the new economy. And what we mean by that is sort of the post-pandemic new economy. So the idea that businesses have to be more accessible, both digitally and also to takeout. The idea that businesses are sort of currently grappling with supply chain and staffing shortages, you know, strategies that might address that. Other projects that could be eligible are digital or modern communication and advertising strategies. And what I should say is that all of the projects would need to show community benefit. So we're not necessarily looking for a project that just benefits one business or entity, even though that may be an outcome. We're also looking for applicants to demonstrate that there is an overall neighborhood or community benefit. So the reason I bring that up now is when we're sort of talking about digital advertising strategies, if one business applied to do, you know, an Instagram to fund an Instagram campaign for their business, that might not necessarily get funded. But if several businesses within a small neighborhood business district applied to do something similar to basically advertise the entirety of the business district, that would potentially get funded. So just to sort of give folks an idea of the differences there. The next category is resident outreach and neighborhood capacity building. So I think in this category, we're sort of recognizing that some of these most impacted neighborhoods, while there may be plans or good ideas about how to revitalize the neighborhood and how to recover not just from the pandemic, but also from pre-existing disparities in that neighborhood, that while those plans or ideas may exist, there may not necessarily be capacity to carry those out. So if there was a project or a plan that perhaps involved an entity or an organization building out that capacity or bringing in some professional expertise to help them build out that capacity or expertise to carry out neighborhood plans, that could potentially be a project that would be funded. So also in this category, projects that could potentially strengthen the civic infrastructure or improve accessibility to government or social services, projects that would strengthen two-way communication channels. So, you know, two-way communication between the city and residents or neighborhood organizations and residents, or improve public access to various public programs or neighborhood and housing resources. The next eligible category are essential neighborhood businesses. So this would be businesses that communities can't really function without, that you can't have a thriving, vibrant community without. So some examples of those would be pharmacies, grocery markets, health clinics, things like that. And it could potentially be, I'm going to just stop sharing for 1 second. There is a member of a neighborhood council that is looking for a link for tonight, and I just want to make sure that it gets to her. So I'm just going to send that real quick, and then I will continue. I apologize. Okay. So it could be, so projects under the essential neighborhood business category could include anything that would, so any commercial rehab to expand or create a business like this where it doesn't exist in a neighborhood or in a neighborhood commercial district, soft cost investments, and or tenant fit out for these sorts of eligible essential neighborhood businesses. I want to remind folks that there's $12 million total in the fund. So I think, you know, if you're envisioning, you know, building a new business and it's going to cost $3 million, that may not get funded, or it may not get funded in its entirety. So I think you want to be reasonable about what you're requesting, understanding that the city has a limited pot of money and lots of folks that are likely going to apply for that money. It's not to say it wouldn't, but I just want folks to sort of think proportionately. And that's sort of the same thing for essential community facilities. So these are, again, you know, all of those facilities that we think about when we're talking about public services. So recreational facilities, community centers, educational facilities, playgrounds, youth development, childcare, health facilities, those kinds of things. Folks could submit projects to invest or expand those sorts of facilities, given that they can show that doing so and receiving those funds would improve the health outcomes for neighborhood residents. And then we've sort of left this other economic recovery projects that are specific to a neighborhood's needs in case there's a category that we missed that doesn't cover sort of the other gamut of things, but that there's a very specific neighborhood need that would otherwise qualify. So the other thing I want to point out is there are I've sort of talked about how there needs to be a overall neighborhood benefit, that it couldn't be to just benefit one business or entity. And if you can't demonstrate that neighborhood benefit, this likely isn't the pot of money for you. That being said, there is sort of a wider, more general ARPA application for businesses that have businesses, individuals, households, and nonprofits that have direct impacts from the pandemic that cannot necessarily demonstrate sort of that neighborhood benefit. And if that was something you were interested in, we've linked to that, and those applications can be found here. And that there's a new department, it's called Recovery and Business Continuity. They are taking in applications for various assistance for folks that have direct unaddressed needs. So before I move on, this was sort of a lot of information to digest. I just want to take some questions if folks have them now before I move on to the next section. Does anyone? Okay, yes, I think I see a question. Gladys, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Tina. Is this project with the one you're going to cover next week, are they interchangeable? And I'll give you an example. For Lower Liberty Heights Neighborhood Council, if I were to call it the hub here in Lower Liberty during the pandemic, people didn't have a place to go, meaning get information, specifically folks that don't speak English. One example would be, I need to access a computer, or I don't have a phone, or can you give me information for an elder that does not speak English, doesn't have any services for SNAP or how to apply, and they can't make it to the senior center, which I think it's on Roosevelt, right?
Yeah, yep.
And we get that a lot in our community. So I'm trying to create like an arch type of proposal that community center could be a hub. How to build a hub? Well, one of the infrastructure is we don't have high-speed internet. We don't have internet at all. We don't have a phone. We rely a lot on. Just an example.
Sorry, when you're saying we don't have internet, you mean the neighborhood council, right? That's what you're talking about?
Correct. I'm talking in the capacity of that.
Okay. So I think if you were going to submit a project or a proposal for something along those lines, you would want to utilize this application.
This one. Okay.
Application next week, the entity itself will not actually receive any funding. The application next week is basically for the city to consider funding, sidewalk upgrades, street and crosswalk upgrades, tree planting. And so it would be city departments actually carrying out the projects. It's really just for neighborhoods to say, please consider funding our neighborhood, and this is our project. And then once the city receives that application, we will schedule a walk in the neighborhood to look at that and come up with a plan. So pretty separate. Separate, so similar, coming out of the pot of funding, except for the application that I'll cover next week. There is additional funding plugged in there, which is CDBG COVID funding. So that expands the area that we can touch a little bit more.
So the proposed, because we've been brainstorming our council and how to come up with ideas in different buckets, right? So the next example from a sidewalk neighborhood, one of the suggestions is improve the street lighting to like a LED because it'll be brighter, and why? Because it can, turn away crime. Our neighborhood is visible. So those are two different ideas. What I'm trying to do, Tina, is kind of get all the information and kind of bucket it into the right proposals. Am I thinking correctly?
Yes, no, I think you are. And if you want, I'm happy to schedule sort of a one-on-one where we can, because it sounds like you guys kind of have a lot going on. And I want
Yeah.
to make sure that neighborhood council is kind of getting in the right directions.
Okay,
So we can schedule something one-on-one to kind of talk through it, because I do think things like the streetlights, I do think the city has a separate plan to kind of address some of the, or is working on a separate plan to address some of the street lighting issues. I think we recognize that that is an issue citywide and not just in any one particular neighborhood.
okay,
So yeah, I think after this, why don't you send me an email and we'll try to set up a time and just talk through some of those different ideas.
okay. And so we bucket them appropriately. Thank you,
Yeah.
Tina.
Okay, Alan, I think you have a question.
Yeah, you answered one of my questions when you answered to Gladys, so thanks. I've heard something about a rolling grants or something. So does that mean it's crucial to or critical to get your application in as soon as possible and not wait to the June 15th deadline?
I mean, I am encouraging folks to submit it as soon as possible, but you do have until June 15th. So I don't think the city will allocate all of the funding prior to June 15th, but I do think we don't want to be we don't want to be going through everything in July. We recognize that applications are going to come in. So we're hoping to start at least announcing some funding as we're moving through. So yes, I would encourage you to get it in as soon as possible. The sooner you get it in, the sooner we can look at it and consider it. Any other questions before I move on to the next section? No? Okay.
What was the first question?
Oh, is there one more, Gladys?
Oh, wait.
Tina, I just wanted to let you know, Theo Alvarado, the president of Lower Liberty, is on, and if you need me to translate anything, I will. Theo, ella comenzó cómo hacer la aplicación. ¿Ok?
Ah, ¿cuál era la primera pregunta?
La primera pregunta era para, lo que ella nos está enseñando aquí es para nosotros con las ideas, hacer la aplicación, y ella va a hacer un meeting con nosotros personal. Tina, I'm telling him that you will be available to meet with Lower Liberty Heights and separate or help us with all the ideas we have, bucket them into the right application process.
Yeah, and if you need Spanish translation for that meeting, just let me know and I will try to have a Spanish speaker at the meeting as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
Theo?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Tina, for making that available.
Sure. Okay, so then moving on to the next section, which is who can apply for funding. So basically anyone can apply for funding. We're anticipating getting mostly applications from nonprofits, neighborhood organizations, and or businesses. We included individuals mostly because we anticipated that there may be some instances where there are individuals doing business as, so that's why we included that in there. If there is an individual that can show projects with community benefit and, then we would consider it, but I don't think we're anticipating there will be sort of hordes of individuals submitting these applications. Other than that, I think that's probably the big thing in this in this section, other than I should say while this doesn't have to happen before an application is submitted, before the city could go to contract, if the entity applying for funds has any outstanding financial obligations to the city of Springfield, those would need to be paid before we could go to contract. Additionally, any entity that had a significant history of non-compliance with prior grant funding requirements from the city would not be eligible to go to contract. I will say I haven't encountered lots of those folks in my time with the city, so I don't anticipate that really being an issue, but I do need to mention it. Another thing, which I think I'm also going to cover in the other, I'm going to skip over that because we're going to cover it in the next section. So the next section is how to obtain application assistance. So I think I've talked about this already, but you can email me, you can call me. My phone number is here. My email address is here. Again, we'll be posting the recordings, all of that on the website that I visited earlier. So that's how you can obtain assistance. And again, next week, I'll be covering the second application in a technical assistance workshop as well. How applications will be evaluated. So not only does your application have to fall, meet one of those eligible projects, sort of fall into one of those categories, but then once we get your application, there are going to be 2 committees, and they will sit down and review them in accordance with the following criteria. So the first one is equity, right? So we're looking for projects that will provide benefit to the highest COVID impacted neighborhoods and communities. The project should focus on providing equity for low income and minority businesses and communities. So there's sort of that acronym BIPOC that stands for Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. So those businesses and communities. And the reason that is because both the city and the federal government have determined that the communities that have low-income residents and or minority residents have been disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is a goal of the funding to ensure that those communities are receiving funding and are deriving benefit from the funding. The second criteria that the committee will look at is neighborhood recovery. So this is sort of what I talked about earlier, that whatever projects you're proposing will have more than just an individual business or individual person benefit, that there will be benefit for the neighborhood and for the community. And again, that it will help business districts adjust to the new normal and stimulate community-based activity and economic growth within those neighborhood districts. The third criteria that we'll look at is how does the project address the harms from the COVID-19 pandemic, and how will the project improve health outcomes? So again, this is COVID funding from the federal government. So they require that anything we spend money on, there's a clear demonstrated benefit and tie back to the pandemic. So your project and your application should demonstrate that your project has a reasonable and proportionate, the project is both reasonable and proportionate to the harms and the impacts from the pandemic. We'll also look at whether the project is community supported. So what that means is, again, we're going back to that community benefit and showing that your project provides that benefit. And additionally, we're going to ask that you demonstrate that there's community support. And there are several ways that we lay out that you can demonstrate that fairly easily. So that could be you obtain a letter of support from the neighborhood council, you obtain a letter of support from a city councilor, you obtain a letter of support from any of the elected representatives from the Massachusetts House or the Senate, a letter from Congressman Neal, or letters of support from residents, community-based organizations, and or businesses within the impacted neighborhood. So we recognize that there's a barrier for some organizations or folks to getting letters of support from elected representatives, which is why we're saying, fine, you don't necessarily have to do that. You could show community support by getting letters from residents or business. Oops, sorry. So I'm just going to ask everyone to mute themselves for the time being so that we don't pick up that background noise. So if you are not speaking, if you can just mute your mic, that would be great. And then the last category is sort of we're going to look at your plan for your project, right? Have you demonstrated that you or your project team have the capacity to carry out the project you're proposing? Does the project you're proposing, have you demonstrated that it will provide the benefits that you're saying that it will? And that you're showing funding need, or you're also showing, are there leverage sources of funding? And if there are leverage sources of funding, have you shown commitments for those leveraged funding? And I'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the budget part as well. So I'm going to hold off on questions for right now until I get to the end of this section. So then, like I mentioned earlier, there'll be a review committee. There's 2 review committees. One is mostly at the department level, so sort of within the development services division, and the department that's managing at the higher level, the ARPA funds. So planning, economic development, community development, neighborhood services, those folks will sit and review it. And then applications that we believe will be funded, should be funded, will then get elevated up to the advisory committee. So that includes a city councilor designated by the council president, the city clerk, the city's chief development officer, our chief administrative and financial officer, and the director of technical assistance and compliance. And then they will forward all recommendations to the mayor for his final approval. So there's sort of a little bit of a lengthy approval process, but the idea here is that it's to try and ensure that there's as much transparency as possible. So no one department can stop an organization or entity from being funded. And there's no favorites being played. Sort of the more folks that are looking at the applications, the more open that the process is. Award announcements, like I mentioned earlier, they'll be made on the city's website. They'll also be made on the city's Office of Communication Facebook page, which I've linked to here, and the Development Services Facebook page. So I will say, if you are on social media and you don't follow either of those pages, I would encourage you to. Both pages are constantly pushing out city announcements. And so separate of this application, there's also all kinds of funding and grant announcements that come out through both of those pages. So if you're representing an entity or an organization within the city and you don't follow those pages, you should. We covered sort of how the funding process will work and the rolling application. So now that we've reached the end of this section, if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. Gladys, did you have a question?
Yep, regarding the budget,
For you.
the funding and the budget.
Yep.
So as a neighborhood council, we apply to Ed Whitley's for grant funding, right? Is
Nope.
this is separate, right?
Yes.
Okay, so for an example, if our application requires to be manned, right, to have like some support to, so what, with that being said, having support, we will need to hire, you know, a part-time worker, someone that could man a few hours. Would that is something that I should be asking Ed Whitley through the request for the grant through that, or is that something that we can request through this grant?
So let me check in with Ed and just sort of see what they're funding this time around, just because I don't know off the top of my head. It sort of changes. So when I've heard a couple different things. So let me check with him and get back to you more specifically on that question.
Because in order to demonstrate, so I'm trying to do the arts, and maybe we can get into a granular level when we meet one-on-one.
Yeah, I
So,
think that's
you know,
probably a good idea.
yeah, okay, because my brain is thinking as we do the overarching, so that we achieve this, in order to achieve this, we need volunteers and bodies, right? So
Yeah,
do we need, you know, to hire someone to be able to execute those things? And my mind is thinking we should update the request to and cover quote an employee, which we don't have.
right. Yeah, so let me touch base with Ed and just kind of see what they're allowing folks to ask for funding, and then let me get back to you on that.
Thank you.
Barbara, did you have a question?
Yes, Tina, can you hear me?
I can.
Yes. So next week we have another meeting. Is there another meeting next week?
Yes, that one
Okay.
is geared specifically towards the neighborhood council application for capital improvements. So when I say capital improvements, it is specifically around walkability upgrades, so sidewalk improvements, crosswalk improvements, tree plantings, curb improvements, things like some roadway improvements within business districts. And that would be the neighborhood council wouldn't actually get the funding, but the city would actually carry out the project. But it's to sort of solicit that request to fund from the councils and understand what they want the city to fund. And we would then set up meetings with councils after we get that application.
Okay, all right. So that wouldn't necessarily apply to Old Hill.
Well, I think if Old Hill wanted to submit an application, yes. This particular session is geared towards the general application, where
Okay.
organizations and entities that are putting in the funding request would actually receive funding back.
Okay. Now,
Okay.
what's the timeline? When is that? That's all due by July?
June 15th is the due date for both.
Okay, June 15th.
Yep, but as we've talked about, the city is going to try to start funding as applications come in. So, you know, sooner the better would be what I would
Okay.
say.
All right,
Yeah,
all right. Is there a time on June 15th? But sometimes they say. after
I think it's just by the end of the day. I think I
End
set
of
a
the day.
deadline for. the-
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yep, sure. Okay, so any other questions before I move on? No. Okay, so obviously this is federal funding, so there are requirements of the funding that we have no control over that will apply. So I'm going to go over those. I'm going to say they seem overwhelming, but I think when I break them down, they're not going to seem quite as overwhelming. The first one is cost reasonableness and procurement. So basically, for any funding that we spend, the city is required to demonstrate that all those costs are reasonable and they are comparable to what would be paid in the private market, even if it wasn't public funding. So if the applicant is a nonprofit organization, what that means is, and your goal is that you're not going to be a direct beneficiary of the funds, but rather you're going to run some kind of program with the funds, or run some kind of program out of what the funds are funding. Then what would happen is we'd receive your application and you'd be designated what's called a subrecipient, which means that all of our procurement requirements from the federal government flow down to the nonprofit. So that sounds scary, but it's not that, it's really not. So what it means is if you are purchasing goods and services or supplies that are coming from outside of your organization, and that amount is between $3,500 and $150,000, you would be required to develop a cost estimate and solicit quotes for those goods and services or that supply. If you're purchasing goods and services that exceed $150,000, and I will say this is not one that we come across very frequently, and we work with lots of nonprofits, then you're required to, again, develop sort of a written cost estimate and solicit competitive proposals that include cost as a criteria. We don't come across that a lot, but if we do, we would certainly talk folks through it and how to do that and give you some examples of how folks have done that in the past. Then, if you are going to be doing construction that exceeds $2,000, so you're going to be getting more than $2,000 in this funding from us to do construction, then you're required, again, to develop an independent cost estimate, a written scope of that work, and solicit competitive bids for that work. We do not require that nonprofits do that prior to award or prior to submitting your application, but you would be required to provide those things to us once you're under contract. And obviously, if you didn't have a very firm idea of what those items might cost, if it then required a budget adjustment upwards, there likely wouldn't be funding to cover that adjustment. So we're encouraging folks to seek quotes for any goods or services that they might be purchasing that are of substantial amount prior to submitting your application. It's not required. If you're a nonprofit, it's not required, but we're encouraging you to do so. Additionally, nonprofits or subrecipients that will be administering programs will also be required to submit quarterly reports that provide updates on all activities and accomplishments for the duration of the contract. Okay. Now, if you're an applicant that is a business or an individual, the requirements are a little different. The procurement requirements don't flow down quite as strictly, but you still need to demonstrate cost reasonableness and that the costs that you're submitting are both reasonable and necessary. So if you're planning construction work, again, that exceeds that 2,000, you're basically doing the same thing. Or you're getting you're basically developing a written description of that work, and then you're getting quotes or bids. If you are obtaining a good supply or service that is outside of your business, then, and it exceeds $3,500, then again, you're going to need to obtain quotes for that. If there's a specific item that is very unique and there's some reason why you couldn't obtain quotes, then you need to have an offline conversation with me about that. And we would have to figure out how we can demonstrate both that that is a reasonable price and that the costs are reasonable and necessary with current market pricing, and that there is no possible way that you could get competitive quotes. I have to say it's pretty rare. I've had to do that for an entity outside of the city once, and it was for a very high-tech turbine that could, there was no other turbine in the private market that met the necessary specifications to fit that space and energy output. That being said, I'm happy to talk with folks around how to work around that if there is no possible way to get there. You should submit your quotes or bids with your application if you are a business or an individual to ensure a speedier review or approval process. I think, you know, for us with a nonprofit organization that's going to be running a program, it's easy for us to compare it to other past programs and have a fairly good idea of what that cost would be and what cost reasonableness should look like. When we're talking about businesses coming in for things like storefront improvements or expansions or tenant fit out, that's going to be a lot harder for us to come up with. So if you're submitting your quotes or your bids with your application, it will help us review it a lot quicker and help us get to funding a lot quicker. Then I should say, if we have a project that includes a capital expenditure over $1 million, so capital expenditures are anything that includes funding for equipment or improvements to properties or facilities, that's a capital expenditure. If you're putting in for something that exceeds $1 million, there's a whole other threshold that the federal government is requiring we meet. So I'm just going to ask in advance, is anyone anticipating submitting for capital expenses over $1 million? It looks like no. That's good. So I'm just going to review those 3 criteria very briefly so that folks hear them in the for the recording purpose, but I'm not going to go over it in detail. So 1, folks need to provide a written description of the harm or the need that will be addressed and why that harm was exacerbated or caused by the public health emergency. 2, they need to provide an explanation of why a capital expenditure is the only appropriate answer to addressing that harm and why existing facilities, programs, or policy changes would not address the need of the harm that was created by the pandemic. And 3, they need to provide an analysis that shows a comparison of the proposed capital project against at least 2 alternative capital expenditures. That being said, since it sounds like nobody at this session is planning to do that, I'm going to skip over that. I'm going to not go into any more detail about that and waste folks' time.
May I ask just one question?
Oh, sure.
For capital expenditure, so we have Our Lady of the Rosary church that was closed back in 2018, which has a rectory, a school, and a nice bathroom. And it was used before. I guess I'll take it offline, but is there a possibility that, again, using a hub like a community center, here is a closed down church that is available to a diverse Spanish speaking community? Would that be an example of a capital expenditure where we can put in a proposal to work with the ISN and the city that it can reopen? Right now, I know it's open for us, but not in the sense of having mass because of the canon law. They closed it without going through the proper channels, but I don't want to get into much detail, but am I thinking?
Yeah, so let's talk about this one-on-one because it sounds complicated and like there's a lot of
Sorry.
details that I'm probably going to need to get you an answer. Does that
Thank
make
you.
sense?
So
Okay.
3 things. Thank you.
Okay, and then the last piece under federal requirements that we have no control over is an entity may not be federally debarred or excluded. I will say, again, in my 17 years with the city, I have not come across an entity that has been federally debarred or excluded. So when you come across this question in the application, you would know if you were federally debarred or excluded. So your answer will likely be no. So now this is the application itself. This is the first section. So before I go on to the application itself, I'm just going to open it up for any more questions about sort of the requirements that I've gone over. And then my goal is to just go through the application, explain to you what should go in each section, and maybe give you some tips around how to answer those questions. Before I do that, just want to make sure no questions. We're good. Okay, so the first section is really basic information about the applicant, the title of your project, the name of your organization, the contact person, contact address. So where would we send any formal written communication to you, a phone number that we can reach you at, an email address that we can reach you at that you will respond to. If you have a DUNS number. So If you have a DUNS number and you know that, that's great. It's basically like a unique identifier for federal funds. If you've received federal funds before, you may have a DUNS number. If you don't, you would just call this number and get it. You don't need it to submit your application, but to go to contract, if you are an organization or a nonprofit, you will need one in order for us to go to contract. So it's better to just call. Honestly, I think they assign the DUNS numbers in less than 24 hours. That being said, okay, so then the next one is, are you federally debarred or excluded? Again, if you don't know if you're federally debarred or excluded, the answer is no. What category do you fall into? Are you a nonprofit, a business individual? Just click that box, whichever one applies. Total ARPA funding amount requested. So this is the total amount that you're requesting from the Neighborhood Economic Recovery Funding Pot. That's this $12 million that we're talking about. Then you would put in your anticipated project start date. There's a nifty calendar to do that. And your anticipated project end date. Again, a calendar to do that. It doesn't have to be exact, but close enough, around how long you're anticipating your project will take to carry out. And then you should provide a description of your project. So get as detailed as you can. We like details. What I like to tell folks is you should write your application as if you are submitting it to a room full of people who have never heard of your organization, your entity, or your business, and they know nothing about your neighborhood. They know nothing about what you do. Give them all the relevant information that they would need to decide that you deserve funding more than any of the other entities that are putting in an application for funding. The next section, this is the neighborhood support and project benefit. So a big part of this section is we want to see that your project is supported by the neighborhood or the community that's targeted, and that there's going to be a neighborhood benefit there, right? So that's what we keep talking about. We want to see that. This is the section where you demonstrate that. So you select the neighborhood that your project is going to apply to. You can select more than one. So maybe you're in the North End and you want to cover the entirety of the North End, but the North End actually encompasses 2 separate neighborhoods. So then you click them both, you click them all. You can provide more detailed description of the neighborhood and the community that's being targeted by the project in this box. This box is optional, so you don't have to provide more description, but it always helps to do so. So the next question is, does your project have neighborhood support? If you click no here, you are not going to get funded. So you want to click yes, and then you want to tell us how you're demonstrating that you have that neighborhood support. So I went over this before. Letter of support from the neighborhood council, letter of support from city council members, from neighborhood residents, from community-based organizations, from neighborhood businesses, or from your elected officials. You do not have to get all of these. You need to at least show us one. If you do not know how to reach your city council members, I have provided a link here, and this takes you to a website that has all of their contact information. If you do not know how to reach your neighborhood council, I've provided a link that will get you to that website and will provide you contact information for your neighborhood council. If you are from a neighborhood council and you click on that link and you notice that the contact information there isn't correct or updated, please let me know so we can update it. If you don't know how to reach your Massachusetts House of Representatives members, there's a website here. This should be a link, so I'll fix it on the back end of the application so folks can click through. Same thing with Massachusetts representatives from the Senate. Again, there's a link here. And if you don't know how to reach Congressman Neal, there's a link here to his office as well. I'll fix these in the back, so on the back end of the application, so when folks go in, they can click right through. But that's how folks can get that. Again, if you can't get any of those, you can still get letters of support from neighborhood residents or from a community-based organization or from a couple of neighborhood businesses to show that that support is there. You would upload those by just clicking on this box. You'll see that there are upload boxes throughout the application. This is how you upload any supplemental information that doesn't go in the boxes, or if we're asking you to attach things. There will be lots of these boxes throughout the application. Under each box, you can attach up to 20 documents. So we encourage folks to attach any supplemental documentation that you think may make your application more compelling for funding. If for some reason you fill up all of those boxes or you're having trouble attaching things, just email me. You can always send it to me and I'll make sure it gets into the application file and goes out with the application review. Okay, so then the next section is describe the COVID-19 impacts or harms experienced by the community or neighborhood that this project will assist. So this is where you're discussing how the pandemic impacted the community that the project will serve. And then once you get past this box, you're going to have to talk about how your project addresses those impacts or harms. So you should think through what you're putting in this box. So if you are a business that's applying for facade improvements, you want to describe a harm that isn't just a harm for you, but was also a harm for the community, and is the harm or the impact that your project will address. So like I said, if you're doing a storefront application, your harm would likely be that because of the shutdowns, your business didn't have any foot traffic, folks couldn't come in, your business was shut down, and not just your business, but all the businesses in the area. So then that reduced economic activity in the neighborhood, it reduced jobs in the neighborhood, it reduced jobs for neighborhood residents, it reduced the business that was coming into the neighborhood district in general. And then you go on to describe how your proposed project would address those harms. So again, if you're doing a storefront improvement, you're addressing not just this funding is going to address not just your individual business harms, but you're also putting in how it's going to benefit the community. So maybe your business is some kind of food market, right? And so you're going to do this great facade improvement. It's going to increase walkability. It's going to increase foot traffic, not walkability, but increase foot traffic. And it will bring more people into the neighborhood commercial district, not just to your business, but to surrounding businesses, and overall increase the economic activity within that business district. That's sort of how that's how you need to frame your applications. If you are working on your application and you're struggling to figure out how you can frame the harm or your impact or the benefits for your project, I'm happy to talk folks through this. I do this all the time. So I'm happy to try to give you some tips or suggestions on how you could better fill those boxes in. The next part is you need to describe how your project will benefit the targeted neighborhood or community. So again, if you're doing this storefront improvement, which I'm going to just use as my low-hanging fruit example here, you're talking about, your neighborhood provides your business provides jobs within the community, you provide fresh food and groceries to the community, which improves health outcomes. This makes your business more walkable to folks in the community. Having these great storefront improvements, maybe it's also going to increase lighting on the exterior of your business, which provides a safety benefit for the neighborhood business district. All of those things, like you really want to layer on and lather us with as much neighborhood and community benefit as you can come up with, because it's important. And then again, you're sort of talking similarly about how the project will help stimulate neighborhood economic activity within the commercial district that's been impacted by the pandemic. And then you're talking about how the project will promote equity and support residents of color or communities of color and their long-term recovery from the pandemic. So maybe your business employs residents of color. Maybe you're an organization that's thinking about doing a digital equity project, and the low income and folks of color in your neighborhood don't otherwise have great access to computers or have good knowledge of how to use computers to improve their business acumen, you know, sort of all of those things. That's how you want to approach this question. Okay, before I move on to the next section, do we have questions about neighborhood support and benefit? No? Okay. Next section is the budget. Okay, so this section, there's this neat button here. You can add line items. So maybe I'm going to go back to storefront improvement because I've sort of thought through this a little bit. Maybe you're going to add a new awning, right? So you're in this box, you're sort of typing in what you want to fund, and then you're typing in the funding amount. Maybe you're also gonna install new glass windows to make it more attractive. Maybe you're gonna install a new sign and some lighting. As you type it in, you'll see this automatically adds those amounts here for you. You want to be somewhat detailed, right? This should be your line item budget. So maybe instead of a business, you're a nonprofit and you're going to run a program. So you want to include your staffing for the program, right? And maybe you also have, you know, I don't know, copying and printing, those sorts of expenses. Maybe you have there's a bunch of different expenses, but you should be line iteming your budget. It shouldn't just be, we want funding for this big project. We have this big giant project, but you're putting your total funding amount and project here. You know what I mean? Like, you should be line iteming your budget so we can understand what are the different elements that you're seeking funding for. And then down here, you have an opportunity, again, it's optional, to provide additional narrative. And I'm going to remind folks what I said earlier. You want to remember that you're submitting an application and you want to act as if though it's a room full of people that know nothing about your organization, your entity, or your neighborhood. So if there is something in your line item budget that could use a little bit more explanation, or there's a reason why you need it that might not be apparent to someone who's not familiar with your organization, just add it down here. Just add a little bit of narrative. You don't have to, but you can. Moving on from the budget, then we ask, are there other sources of leverage funding contributing to your project? So what that means is, are there other sources in your project? So if you're telling us that the total cost of your project is $50,000, but you're only seeking $40,000 from the city, then that means you've got another $10,000 in there that's not funded, and we're going to want to know, where's that funding coming from? That's leverage funding, right? So maybe you have private equity that you're going to plug into it, or maybe your organization already has funding from another grant that you're going to plug into it. This is where you should be describing. So if you click yes here, this is where you should describe your other funding that may be going into the project. Also, if you're seeking a fairly substantial amount of funding, it helps to say to the city, yes, we're asking you for this large amount of funding, but But look, we're also bringing all this other money to the table too, that other entities might not be bringing to the table. So it can help if you have leverage funding. Then we're asking, is your organization a nonprofit that will be administering a program? If you click yes, then what's going to pop up here is those procurement requirements that I talked about under federal funding requirements. And there's a spot here where you can upload any documents that you may have to show that you sought quotes for some of those costs. Again, like I said, if you're a nonprofit, and even if you're a business, you're not necessarily required to do that, to put it in here. But if you're not really familiar with the cost of a good or supply that you're purchasing outside of your organization, you may put the wrong amount in your budget, and then there may not be funding on the back end to plug that gap. So you want to be really confident in the budget you're submitting. And oftentimes the best way to do that is to make sure you're getting your quotes on the front end. Again, here we're asking, is the applicant a business or an individual that will be a direct beneficiary? Because again, that sort of changes the procurement requirements. If the answer is yes, which if you're a business and you're receiving the funding to improve your business, you're considered a direct beneficiary. This is where, again, we're asking about those procurement questions. So if you have construction that exceeds 2,000 or supplies and services that exceed 3,500 that are outside of your business, we detail those requirements, and we're asking you again to submit the quotes for those items here in this upload box. And again, you can upload up to 20 items in here. And again, if for some reason you're exceeding that and there's not enough room for you to upload everything you have, just email me and you can send them to me and I'll make sure they get into your application file. I don't think this applies to anyone, but this is where we're talking about if you have a capital expenditure that exceeds 1 million, you're going to have to fill in all of these boxes and do the comparable analysis that the federal government's asking us for before we can even consider funding that. If you know that doesn't pop up and you can just move along. Before I move on past the budget section, do we have questions about budgeting? Nope. Okay. Moving on to duplication of benefits. So the federal government prohibits us basically from double funding anyone for any particular need, right? So we're going to ask you, have you received COVID-19 funding from any other source? There's sort of a drop-down menu here where we tried to plug in some of the most likely duplication of funding sources that that folks might have experienced. So, you know, some businesses got prime the pump grants. There's all kinds of federal funds that went out throughout the pandemic. So say you got a prime the pump, those were pretty small. You would just plug that in and you would tell us what the use of that funding was. For a lot of folks, they used it for staffing. That's fine. It's okay if you got that. You just need to tell us about it so we can look and see what you use that funding for. And as long as you didn't use it for the same exact use that you are asking for funding for, it's fine. We just need to disclose it and make sure we have it in your file. So, you know, even if you got a prime the pump grant for staffing, it would have been limited to a certain time period. So it would have been, you know, say April of 2020 to September of 2020. If you're a business or an entity and you're still, you know, more likely it would be an organization looking to run a program for staffing right now. But you're looking for staffing to run a program in the future, that's okay if you already received previous federal funding related to the pandemic for staffing, assuming that funding was time limited to a previous point in the past, which it most likely was, because most of that funding was paid out in some form of reimbursement basis. You just need to disclose it to us so we can work through it and make sure we document it appropriately, so that 2 years from now, you're not getting a letter from the federal government saying, hey, whoa, you double dipped here, now you need to repay money. That's what we're trying to prevent here. So that's why we're asking you for this. If there is, so if you got some other pandemic related funding that's not included here, just click other and type it in and just describe that use, okay? And then there's also an additional optional narrative box here if you want to describe that. Obviously, unemployment funding shouldn't apply unless you are an individual, like doing business as, then you might want to disclose it. But if you're an organization or an entity, you're probably not looking to disclose that. It's more along the lines of some of these other grant funding options that were available. Okay. Section 5, which is your capacity to complete the project. So this is where you're going to convince us that you can do what you're proposing to do. So tell us about any past experience that your organization or your business has carrying out this kind of project. If you're a business and you're looking to do some sort of capital improvement or facade improvement, something like that, then you would also probably give us some information about your contractor, whoever is going to be overseeing that project. And again, talk about the relevant experience. There's an upload box here because another really good thing to upload, and we've had organizations do this already, is to upload resumes or listing of past experience, just to demonstrate, or past projects, to demonstrate that you have the ability to carry out the project like you said you would. And then the last section of the application is where you can attach various items. Again, these aren't required to submit the application, but if we're going to go to contract, we're likely going to need a bunch of these things. So it helps just to attach it, sort of makes the process go smoother. You sign your digital signature and then you click submit, and it'll pop through to me. I'll get an email telling me it's come through, and you should get an email back also telling you that it's come through. If you get partway through the application and you realize that you are not going to have time to finish it, you can save it here and it will send you a link to your application. You can take your link and it can also email you that link. So you just pop in your email address and it will email it to you, and you can go back and work on your application. Okay. Do we have questions now?
So Tina,
Yeah.
I have a quick question. So say if you got a letter from a state representative,
Yep.
Is this where you would attach it?
You would attach it. So honestly, you can attach it to any one of these little upload boxes. The best place to attach it is in this neighborhood support and project benefit spot right here. But it doesn't really matter where you attach it because they all kind of dump into the back end of the application, and I'll see the attachment either way.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Alan, you are muted.
Yeah, getting back to the DUN number for a second. If we don't have a DUNS number, do we wait until we get the grant to apply for it, or should we do it before then?
It's completely up to you. It doesn't really matter to us. It's just before we go to contract, you're going to need to get it. So
Okay.
It's up to you.
Okay. The other thing is there a deadline for completing the projects?
Yes. So we haven't plugged in a deadline. There is a spending deadline. I don't have that exact date off the top of my head, but I will get it and I will post it on the website as one of the frequently asked question. So I want to say the city's total spending deadline is 2026, but obviously we're going to want folks to be completing projects before that. because we don't want to be in a situation where the treasury is sweeping funds. So we're not going to give you the absolute last day that fund will be swept. It'll probably be a deadline before that. So I will post that on the website. Any other questions? No. Okay, great. So I am going to post this recording probably tomorrow, and then if you have more specific questions about your particular project, organization, anything like that, you can call me, email me. If you want to set up a one-on-one time to kind of talk through some more complicated issues, I'm happy to do that. You can just email me and we'll work out a time that will work. Otherwise, thank you everyone for attending. I hope this was helpful and provided you some information, and I look forward to seeing everyone's projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina.